This is Heather Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of NAMI Southwest Ohio. We just want to say welcome, and we're going to give it about 3 minutes, and then the panel will begin. Mr. Eugene Blaylock Jr. is going to be the moderator today. So welcome. Thank you for joining.
Again, welcome. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes.
All right.
Good afternoon and welcome. I want to thank everyone for joining us today as we continue the conversation surrounding mental health and racism. My name is Eugene Blaylock Jr. I am the superintendent of North College Hill City Schools. I'm on the board of directors for NAMI Southwest Ohio, and I will be moderating today's panel discussion. Between the global pandemic and systemic violence against the Black community, these times are fraught with turmoil. And as violence against the Black community, okay, hold on, I gotta get this right because I'm gonna get emotional, hold on. It's been a rough week with everything going on. All right, let's start this off right. Again, I am Gene Blaylock. I will be moderating today's program. Between the global pandemic and systemic violence against the Black community, these times are fraught with turmoil, and it shows in the mental health of our marginalized populations. In the average year, 1 in 5 adults in the United States experience mental illness. However, a new statistic from the CDC tells us that 1 in 3 adults report experiencing symptoms of anxiety and depression since the onset of the pandemic. Calls to NAMI's helpline have increased by 65%. We have 7 in 10 American teenagers are struggling with their mental health, and Black children are more than twice as likely to die by suicide than their white peers. Also, suicide is the 3rd leading cause of death among Black men. This conversation feels particularly timely as a verdict was reached last week in the case of the murder of George Floyd. As NAMI CEO Daniel Gilderson stated this week, the quote is, "The continued killing of Black and other people of color by law enforcement has had a profound impact on the mental health of our communities. The effects of trauma and re-traumatization are real, and it's time we stop pretending the exposure to continued violence and death does not affect individuals and the community as a whole. As we have said before, racism is a public health crisis. This verdict is historic Unlike in so many other cases of racial violence, justice has been served. This is a victory, but the fight for racial justice against systemic racial violence is not over. End of quote. We know that mental health concerns in Black individuals are not new by any means. In the 2018 survey showed that nearly 5 million African Americans with mental illness, close to 70%, had not received treatment. Why is this? Last year, we opened up the conversation, and we're grateful for the opportunity to continue that conversation today as we continue to work towards mental health for all. So I'd like to introduce you to today's panelists. Joining us today are Margot Spence, President and CEO of First Step Home. We have Dr. Ryan A. McDabb, NKU College of Health and Human Service Fellow. And we have the Honorable Kendall Cole, Magistrate of the Hamilton County Probate Court. I thank you all so much for being here. At times, I know this is going to be challenging to us to talk about, just because I think it's real to all of us. And we're going to start the conversation off with Ms. Spence. Could you share your thoughts on the disparities in the mental health care in Black communities, in the Black community?
Well, good afternoon. And I would like to begin by first thanking Heather Smith and NAMI for inviting me to be part of this distinguished panel. It really does take courage for an organization to sponsor conversations on race. Eugene, yes, I would be happy to share my thoughts on the disparities in mental health care in the Black community. As a country, we have a very serious problem with racism, systemic racism, sexism, and all the other isms, actually. Over the past year, we have been forced to take a serious look at ourselves. More comprehensive data is provided on race and demographics that demonstrate the disproportionate distribution of resources to the Black community in relation to health issues. As we witness the disregard for human life and the killing of Black men and women by those in authority in the Black community, it is traumatizing. We know this has had a devastating impact on the mental health of the Black community. We must admit the truth and be willing to make changes by holding accountable those who are in opposition to fairness for all. Mental health care is a system impacted by systemic racism. Mental health care in the Black community is a reflection of our overall country. The risk factors of poverty, unemployment, underemployment, homelessness, substandard housing, lack of transportation, and affordable quality childcare. The inability to access healthcare, be it behavioral, mental health, and physical health. These are all data points where we score extremely high in the African American community and are very reflective of an unfair system. Mental illness in the Black community is often seen as criminal behavior as opposed to healthcare as it is approached in the white community. Thank you for allowing me to express my feelings.
Thank you. Anybody else on the panel just want to share your thoughts on some disparities that you see in your work?
The bias is so prevalent and so matter of fact for so many. And many people are quite emboldened in these terrible times we're living in. And I don't want to point the finger at our coworkers, but you do see bias everywhere.
Definitely. Doctor?
You know, I'm just sitting here reflecting, and, you know, we all know historically that there's been unequal distribution of resources, and not just of African Americans, but of people of color. But what I like that Margot broke down is that, you know, she spoke briefly about how behavior associated with mental health conditions is often criminalized. And I think that, without going into potential topics that we'll get into later, that it boils down to, you know, intrinsic racism, but then also I think a lack of understanding of various cultures within this US that we live in. So being able to not just only recognize when a person may be experiencing mental health symptoms, but even the differences in how people dialogue, which can impact healthcare as well, and diagnoses. And so I don't have anything specifically say to address the specific question, but this is what's going on in my mind. And I'm just trying to keep still and not be too emotive, so.
Thank you. I know in a public school setting, we're in an urban environment in North College Hill City Schools, and we're dealing a lot with the social, emotional, and well-being of our students.
Mhm.
And I know that's been particularly important as we move forward. Some of the things that the students have seen in community that comes into the school system, and we have to work with our staff also to understand some of those biases. And when you deal with people, particularly African-American males, that every situation is a violent situation. Every situation doesn't have to end with someone ending up calling the police or someone going to jail. So sometimes we have to concentrate on how do we de-escalate situations, and in the school system is extremely important because we don't want to create that pipeline to prison type of situation. So thank you. We're going to go ahead with Dr. Hold on, I want to get your last name correct.
Okay.
I got your first name. Dr. Renee.
Yes.
I got that one. Say the last name so we can make sure we got it.
McDade.
McDade, there we go. Dr. McDade. So why do you think the African Americans' access to treatment as significant, or African American access to treatment at significantly lower rates in comparison to our white counterparts?
Absolutely. So first, I just want to tell you, thank you so much, Eugene, for that wonderful introduction. And don't be afraid to mispronounce my name. I've been called worse, believe me. So it's okay. And just to NAMI, to Heather, and for everyone else here that's on the Zoom, I'm just so blessed and thankful to be here. And so my research shows that the top 3 reasons why African Americans and other minority groups, or even our white counterparts, are less likely to access mental health care services are in part due to cost of services. So Margot, she spoke briefly about the fact that certain insurance plans, they may not cover certain health services associated with mental health care. And if they do, it's for a shortened amount of time, right? So that's one factor. The second one is also dealing with structural barriers. And so if you can access or afford a mental health care provider, are they qualified? Are they able to assist you specifically with what symptoms or situations that you're dealing with? And if you can find someone, can you reach them? So are you on a bus line, or do you have a car? Last but not least, and this is the most significant factor that discourages people from all races and ethnicities, but especially in the African American community, is stigma. So, you know, with African Americans being already a marginalized population, we're dealing with this, what's called double stigma. So intrinsic, what we do to ourselves, how we see ourselves, and then also outside perceptions. And so I'll just speak candidly, you know, I'm an African American female, you know, I'm educated, I have my doctorate degree, but I also have my own bouts with anxiety. And, you know, even though my research is in mental health stigma, when I think about going to seek treatment for that, I'm scared. I know the research. I know what they're going to think of me. And God forbid if I was to say something like, I know the Lord is able to, you know, carry me through. I hear his voice. You hear what? And so I'm again not trying to delve into into different topics, but this fear comes in on what am I going to be perceived as? And then I hate to even admit this, even knowing the research, I even have that same voice that runs in my head as well. I'll take it off me and then I'll share something else and then I'll give it over to another panelist. You know, research has also shown us that within African American communities, not just with our minds, but even physical ailments, when we go to see clinicians, sometimes we're overdiagnosed or there's other biases that the physicians may hold that this implicit bias, and that can also deter those that have already sought treatment from going back. So that's a little bit why I believe that we have seen in the research that African Americans are significantly less likely to access or stay engaged in mental health care services.
For the rest of the panel, and this is something that we know in the Black community is systematic. I know in our families and some of our, I'll just speak on my family. I know it's a lot of mental illness that as I grew up and ventured out, I start seeing that things that happen outside my house was different than things that happen inside my house. So I know it was some mental illness there. Do you all believe that these things are changing, and what will it take to change some of that as far as just the stigma or the conversation we can have within our families or within the Black community to say, hey, if you need help, help is out there and what they can do?
Yeah, I'll start that. So I recently conducted a study, and I looked at mental health stigma in African American church culture. So I surveyed a couple of churches within the Cincinnati area, and one of the things that I can say that will debunk and take away some of the power that stigma holds is education. So I think, and I'm trying not to put on my religious or spiritual hat here, but
it's Sunday, it's okay.
But what I really want people to know is that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. Hallelujah, regardless of if you have an anxiety diagnosis, whether it's schizophrenia or whatever it is. Maybe you don't even have a diagnosis. Maybe you're just going through, okay? And once you take that power back of something being wrong, but rather it's that I'm also born in sin and shaped in iniquity. So when that fall came, it opened us up to some things that may not be as pleasant. But even with the temptation, God is able to make a way of escape, whether it's through prayer or medication or both. And so really it starts with education and changing the perception on how we see mental illness. For me to share with you that I have an anxiety diagnosis, I don't do that. But I think it's so timely that, we, hallelujah, as people, we see each other as empowered, even in our frailty. So for you all to hopefully see me and to say I'm smiling and I'm in the fight, but yeah, sometimes I struggle with this, that it takes away the fear of if I have this, then I can't do that. So that's what I would say is education and just really taking back what the diagnoses, that negative connotation, and saying, no, I own this and I'm still blessed and highly favored. So.
Anybody else, or go ahead?
Okay, I was just going to add, I think that trust is very important.
Definitely.
And definitely a conversation, being open, transparent, and for folks just feeling comfortable and trusting the individual that's providing the support, where to go, and sharing their own story. I think, coming out of the closed mindset that we can't talk about these things openly is very important. So I really appreciate the doctor sharing her story.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I agree. Mr. Coles, you have a unique perspective due to your position in probate court. You see individuals living with mental illness in times of great turmoil. How do you see race factoring into their experiences?
I think it's very relevant, and again, have to get rid of the stigma surrounding mental illness. And in terms of race, it's unfortunate. I see it, we're treated less compassionately. People are a bit more matter of fact about how they deal with us, very clinically, instead of, I use the word compassion. And so I think there is a higher rate of reticence towards accepting this sometimes in the Black community. I'm not sure if I've answered your question.
Well, just how is it, when we look at factoring into their experiences, some of the things that they possibly gone through when they walk through your court. And I'm gonna chime in. You said something a little earlier when you said emboldened, when you talked about that, and individuals being emboldened to do things. And one of the things that this happened to me yesterday, and I just want to share this. So as a Black man in North College Hill and a superintendent of North College Hill school system, I know the mayor, I know the administrator, I know the police chief, I know the police officers. I know them and I know they know me. But when I pull out my street and one of those police cars gets behind me, I immediately get nervous to the point where yesterday I found myself sweating and I'm swerving because I keep looking up to see them behind me. And it's just, when I think about that and me being, this is the way I feel in my community with people who know me and lightweight like me, so I can only imagine some of the things that other brothers and sisters, people of color, they go through outside of their community or within their community if they're being policed in such a manner. And I think that affects individuals, and we get in situations where we just in a situation because of our past history. And it's almost like the doctor said, we have these anxiety attacks. And that's exactly what it was. It was an anxiety attack that I had in my neighborhood with the people that I love in my community. And it's sad, but it's true. And it's interesting. I don't know.
You hate to say that race is always a factor,
Yeah.
but when I'm around police officers, prosecutors, other magistrates or judges, I'm always openly kind. So many of them are so cruel in how they deal with Black folks. And I want it to be known that I'm not a part of that. I don't want to be a part of that. And if you're determined to be cruel, you're going to look cruel around me because I'm not going to be unkind ever. And so I think for some of the citizens that you serve, they understand that race is an issue when it's somewhat behavioral or if they're hearing, and it's quite terrible.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add anything to that before I move on to our next question?
I think that when we think about, historic racism and then structural racism, I'm reminded, just to Koz's point, just of working with colleagues, and I'm trying to be very careful not to say organization names. That's why I'm talking slowly. But sometimes there is this overarching culture that it is okay to be cruel. And I think, we're all adults. It's like, okay, well, words can't hurt us, but they do. And I'm thinking of especially minorities, African Americans, that are subjected to these microaggressions, these this to us is blatant. It's blatant disrespect, right? But when sometimes you can't, hallelujah, you can't pinpoint it, or because it wasn't a physical assault, we're taught to just let it go, walk it off. And what's unfortunate is that, and I think, Eugene, you said this earlier, that everything that's going on around us is impacting our bodies and our minds. And I just want to, validate anyone out there that is, maybe their life on the surface is good. Maybe they have a job and maybe they have a car, but they're just overwhelmed. And it's a real thing, how people treat you, the issues that we're dealing with, George Floyd, and this is not new. This has been going on for a while, but that does have an impact on mental health. And I think that for minorities, especially, this is our life. And so we're carrying unseen loads that persons that are not of a minority or racial ethnic group, they don't carry. And so what we experience is real. And I would say even more just at a severe rate because of the compounding factors. So.
I agree. It's been something I've been saying, and I'm gonna get the quotes. I'm gonna hold off before I say it, but it has something to do to be a Black person or a person of color in America. You're just in a constant state of rage. You would have
Yes.
to be,
Yeah.
if you understand what's going on. It was from Brother James Baldwin, but I'm gonna read the exact quote when I find it again. But I've heard that and I keep saying it. And I think it's a situation when you talk about being traumatized and re-traumatized by saying the same thing. And like you said, it's not anything new. I go back to when I was on UC College campus, when I saw the Rodney King beating and they were striking this man with this baton and they kept saying he's trying to get up. And I'm like, when? But those were the beginnings of this, and you become traumatized by it. And I think to live, to walk, and to live in America at this point, because I think people are emboldened. I think they feel like they can say and do almost anything that is tough, very, very tough out here at this point. I think we all suffer from a piece of PTDS, post-traumatic disorder. I think there's no doubt in my mind that I suffer from that through everything that I deal with on a day-to-day basis. And like you said, you just got to kind of work through it and be conscious of it, but understand that it's true. And other individuals have to also understand that that's true and that's your reality. So not theirs, that's your reality. And we have to work through that. Dr. Ryan, I've got another question for you. How does cultural bias or the perpetuation, of false stereotypes impact diagnoses and treatment plans in the minority population? So how does cultural bias or I can't get this word right, but you know what I'm saying.
I do. No, I'm with you.
Okay, of false stereotypes impact diagnoses and treatment in minority populations?
Absolutely. I'm just shaking my head because that's such a loaded question and I'm trying to provide a concise answer. So if I go all over the place, you guys jump in and say, hey, Ryan, take it too far left. So I'll first start with, the fact that I'm a Christian. I want to lay that down because we know that God can do all things. And for African Americans, the church is the hope of our culture. And so what I've seen from my personal experiences as well as my research is that because we know God can do anything but fail, that sometimes there's this misconception that if we seek treatment, that somehow we don't believe in God. And we have to remember Luke was a physician. God, David said, however you bless me, I'll be satisfied. So whether you give me some medicine, Jesus, or whether we gonna pray this through, but knowing that, God is not restrictive to one place to move. But sometimes in our minds, that can be a true barrier to why African Americans, from a cultural perspective, will seek out help. In addition to historic trauma, and we keep talking about that, but this is huge because we've already been marginalized forever, as long as we've been here on this planet. And so because of that, we're taught to keep things to ourselves because unfortunately, in racial and ethnic minority groups, sometimes when you reach out for help, it has this funny way of kind of biting you in the rear end. And so what do I mean by that? For example, there has been times, and it's reported in the literature, when people go to seek help, there's higher rates of, I won't say misdiagnosis, but more severe diagnoses. So we talked about earlier, I think it was you, Eugene, you said that it could be two African Americans, it could be two males and a female, it doesn't matter. But when we're escalating in our speech and we're getting loud, that doesn't always have to result in the police being called. So what do I mean by that in terms of diagnoses and why people would be afraid to go to the clinician? We've seen in the research that where African-American males have had higher rates of diagnosis of schizophrenia. And part of that is due to the fact that sometimes on how we present in terms of our speech, our behaviors, our mannerisms. And so when the question, I think originally said, what type of cultural biases, perpetuate this, fear of getting connected? Well, these are part of those cultural biases. The other thing I would say, and I'll close with this, is that, African Americans, we are just an extremely strong people. And so if and when we need to get assistance, it's sometimes seen as weak. This is especially apparent in African American males. You know, they don't, you know, I'm not gonna say they don't, but typically you don't see African-American males, they're not going to the doctor as much. And it's this ideology that we can do it because we've had to. And so what I would say to kind of thwart that or to stop those misconceptions is to help people to understand, and it's really education, and that in your most vulnerable state, there's a level of strength there. And so you reaching out isn't weakness, but it's an awareness of saying, I need additional supports. And when God made us, He didn't make us to live in isolation and be alone. So it's kind of shifting that dynamic on how we perceive asking for assistance as being weak, but rather a sign that, hey, I need my community to come in. I hope that answered the question, Eugene.
Yes, yes. I do want to thank Ms. Collins. She did write in the quote that was on my mind, but I couldn't
Yes.
think of it. But it's from James Baldwin. It says, to be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time. So you're almost in some type of mental, you're going through some type of mental distress all the time if you're conscious of what's going on in your community and what's out here. And he penned it a long time ago, but I think it's true to this day. So I just wanted to thank you, Ms. Collins, for providing us that direct quote. I'm gonna move on to Mr. Coles. You issue orders for hospitalization and treatment for mental illness. Do you see a higher rate towards accepting these in the Black community?
So your question is, are African Americans less likely to accept mentally ill citizens? I want to make sure I understand the question.
Yes.
Okay. I would say yes. We've got to continue to pound away at the stigma. And I tell African Americans in court all the time, we're all the same. No one's better than anyone. Doesn't matter what your level of education is, doesn't matter what your income is. And if you need help, you get help. It's
Right.
that simple. And I think Dr. McDade is correct. It takes real strength to do that, to understand that you are vulnerable, and you have to step away from that and get help. It starts with people understanding you're not judging them. And it's just a stigma. And if you need help, you get help. But unfortunately, I think in our community, there is some difficulty with people accepting that. So many people are so prideful.
Mhm.
It's difficult, I think, to accept that you maybe have an issue that you need help with.
Right.
Anybody else want to add on to some of that? I know it's kind of specific to his position, but just the idea of not accepting help or being reticent to accept help in the community. Have you all seen? Ms. Margot, Ms. Spence, I know in your company, I know you deal with some of this. Have you seen that?
Well, I think that people have to feel comfortable in the environment, to individualize treatment, to have clients involved with developing their treatment plan, building on the strengths that they have, working as a partner to get to whatever the goals the client, women, we work with women and the children, what they want, not trying to put something on them, getting away from so many labels of people. I think most people want to get better, but they have to find the resources, they have to find the environment to feel safe to do that. So we try to make sure that we have a safe environment. We have folks that are properly trained in cultural competence, and to make sure that we're building on the strengths of individuals rather than, looking at all the negative issues that may have come forth by others.
Thank you. Dr. Rene, I'm going to just throw a question over to you. It's kind of a softball, but I just want to throw this over to you. Are you seeing more, and maybe a loaded question, but are you seeing more African Americans going into psychology and things of that nature? Was that part of your research?
So my research initially when I was in grad school focused on African American adolescent disparities. So I looked at teen suicide, marijuana use, and school bullying. And then when I had a family member who was diagnosed with a mental illness, it shifted my research. And so long story short, I have not seen as many African Americans going into psychology or psychiatry. And just a side note, my PhD is public health. So I didn't go myself. I did a postdoc in behavioral medicine and clinical psychology, but my background was in public health education. So I would say, no, I'm not, but there, and that's, it's interesting because there's a shortage of African-American psychologists here in Cincinnati. And so I think that's a good plug, Eugene, to say, we need that, especially to Margot's point about culturally competent care. And by no means am I saying that if you're not Black, you can't help me. But I do think that lived experience you can't not say that plays a part onto how you serve your patients. So yeah, we need more African American psychologists and psychiatrists for sure.
Thank you, and I definitely like the part that I did deal with that with in education, where it's like we need more African American teachers. Yes, we do. We know that it's tough getting African American teachers, but we do have some teachers of other races that are culturally competent, and they're here to fight the good fight for us. But I do agree with you where it's not, sometimes they say, well, you got to have only a Black teacher to do this. And I think lived experience is something to that. And I think we can get them, great. But I think we have to work with the individuals that we have and have to make sure that we coach them up and train them up. So they may not have lived that experience, but we can provide them with the resources and the support they need to be attentive to the needs of our students. And just like in the clinical, or even Mr. Coles, when you talked about the magistrates and judges, although they might not have an understanding, can we be that person, that role model to them that they can look to and say, oh, they do act, we can act a little differently towards individuals. So I think it's incumbent on us to at least try to continue to teach at every chance we get to individuals, to make sure that they know that yes, you too can be part of the solution. You just have to understand what's going on.
Right.
It takes courage to be kind sometimes
Yeah.
in the face of cruelty all around you, but it must be your goal.
Definitely agree.
Everybody
Thank you.
deserves respect, and folks need recognition. I don't care what color you are. And the more we see each other, really see each other, I think we will all do a better job in all that we do.
And I think that's the importance of some of the things that NAMI is trying to do with these open sessions and panel discussions. Is basically to spark the conversation. We're by no means, and I speak for myself, I don't have all the answers. I'm continuously trying to grow and learn more, but I think just the opportunity to hear individuals in dialogue is important. And I don't think we do enough of that. And I think once that begins, we'll see a change. I know in the school community, we've seen the change with our police and how they do policing, because the resource officer is constantly in the building. They're part of the staff at this point. So it's not, when you see them, you don't automatically think, oh, somebody's about to go down. So I think that's a good part of it. I think you have to have those relationships and dialogue and continued open dialogue. Ms. Spence, can you talk about the change in the stigma surrounding mental illness over the past 10 years in the Black community that you've seen?
Well, I don't know if it's really the last 10 years, but just from my own experience and reflection for myself, I think that Of course, there's still stigma. It's not anywhere where it needs to be as far as people seeking treatment, but it's a lot better than what it was 10 years ago. And I am very optimistic with the younger generation. And the younger generation is anyone younger than myself. I think people are more willing to talk about their mental illness and how a therapist is being helpful or, seeking help. I just think that you see more about it on TV, and there's more discussion about it in church, and understanding that we can pray, but we could also get the support that we need from therapists and medication, whatever it takes. It's not a singular situation as to how we can get better. I think people are more willing to hear that. I think the younger generation, though, is willing to spell out what they expect from a therapist. And first on the list is being respectful of who they are. They're more apt to ask for and demand, what type of support they will need for mental health or any other kinds of issues. So for me, I think it's a lot better. I think we have a long way to go, but the more conversations that are held like this, the more peer-to-peer interaction, I think we will continue to improve in this area.
And just to add on to what you said, and this is open to all our panelists, how do we, you talked about the young adults and the younger generation being more vocal, but how do we continue to teach them to be, a true advocate for themselves? And what can we do to improve that, or at least to teach that?
I'll chime in. I think, and I teach at NKU, and these are some things that we're currently addressing now with faculty and students on how do we, especially for our minority students, be a voice and be an advocate for those that may not be able to speak for themselves. And the first thing I think on an individual level is making oneself available. So, and that doesn't matter what setting you're in, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a mental health advocate, but just in wherever you find yourself, wherever that space is, being an ear and being willing to lend your services where you can. I think that's the first step. And then I think, depending on your position of power, for example, Miss Margot, she's the president of, I believe, is First Step. And so she interacts with people that are, maybe dealing with dual diagnosis, addiction, and mental health. And so working so closely with this population, she may then have the ability to take it to the board or to other legislators, or to even teach the population that she works with on how to call their state legislator to say, hey, talk about these things being put into practice, or these policies that you would like to see. And so I think it starts there. I think from a systematic level, you have to start getting policies in place that go beyond being a kind person, because not everyone is as awesome as Mr. Coase. And so I do think sometimes we need some teeth and some things to make people shift, but you can't do that until you start having those hard and tough talks and conversations to see what things do we need to target. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, I did. Mr. Cole, do you want to add on anything?
I'm not sure. I think that's a great question. I'm not sure how you teach a young person to be an advocate for themselves. Such a challenging time to be a young person now, being pulled in a million directions. So it's a great question, but I'm not sure how you could help young people.
And I like what Dr. Ryan said about providing them with a voice. And it's interesting because you have to provide them with a voice, but you also have to help them to understand when and where to use that voice.
Yeah.
I have a daughter that's about to graduate from Tennessee State, and she took African-American Studies course just recently this last semester, and she's become quite vocal about everything. Everything. She's extremely conscious. I'll say that at this time. And she looks at things with a critical eye now, and the questions that she has and some of the statements, I'm happy I'm there to guide her, but I fear for those who don't have someone there to help them with their voice and understanding what they see and kind of walking them through that path, or walking that path with them. And I think that's extremely important. So I think it's something I agree with you. I don't have the answer to that. I want to throw it out, and maybe for us and the panelists, it's something we all can talk about and try to figure out what can we do to help our young folks have a voice, but have a voice where, and I'm just going to be blatantly honest, where it won't get them killed or put them in a situation for them to be harmed. And I think that's important. And that's one of the things I struggle with as a father with a daughter who's now graduating in psychology, as a matter of fact, on Saturday. But she is really, it's interesting to see it. You know, when you see somebody come into conscious and some of the things that they start questioning that they thought was okay all their lives, now they see a different light or a different side. So with that, I do want to say, I want to thank you all so much for your time and contribution to today's conversation. At this time, I'd like to open up our virtual audience for some questions. I know that we do have some currently typed in to our chat box. So individuals who are who's watching, who would like to contribute questions, please at this time, you can type your questions into our chat box and we'll read it, or we'll unmute you yourself so you can ask. So at this time, I'll turn it over, and I believe someone's going to start asking questions.
All
Okay,
right.
there we
The
go.
first question we had from Dr. Nelson, and Dr. Nelson asked, do you feel that with the African American community, if the church or clergy supported mental health initiatives, then people would be more encouraged to get help?
I do. Somebody else jump in, definitely.
I would definitely say so. The church has a major voice in the Black community, I feel, and there's a great deal of respect for not only the minister, but also the leadership in the church. And I think that they have a strong voice on many different levels, one being mental health help.
I would agree.
All right. It looks like we have a hand raised. Ms. Clark, would you like to unmute and ask your question yourself?
It's more of a kind of, it's just feeding into what was just being spoken about. I'm a nurse. I've worked in behavioral health for a while, but I do more in education now. I've had conversations with a lot of the preachers in the Black community. And one of the things that I did when I was speaking with them, I asked them to identify, like, if you have diabetes or if you have high blood pressure, things like that. And I challenged them. I said, so I challenge you to stop taking your medication, because if you take this medication, you clearly don't trust God. And they all just looked at me. And I said, and then one of them says, well, if I don't take my insulin, I could die. And I said, so when you consider your worship, family who are dealing with things like depression, I said, your diabetes, you lack a hormone called insulin from your pancreas. They're lacking a hormone called serotonin from their brain. So what is the difference between their need and yours? And, and I said, and potentially they can die too. If we as a community and you guys as religious leaders in these communities don't stand up and you don't encourage them, and if you can't help them, learn the resources to give to them so that they can seek the help and support it, rather than bashing and shaming because they are on medication or because they're seeking help.
Definitely. Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a very good point. They have the opportunity to really help folks seek mental health, but they too may need the education and the awareness of, the resources that are available. So that's a very good point.
Thank you, Ms. Clark. I appreciate you having those conversations with our religious leaders. That's important.
Okay, so we have another question in the chat box. Dr. Nelson asks Magistrate Coase, in your experience, do you find that incompetence, involuntary admission, or forced medication rulings are being sought more for the African American patients?
That's a tough question. Hi, Dr. Nelson, by the way. That's a tough question. I think we're more inclined to be criminalized versus involuntary hospitalizations. So I wouldn't look at an involuntary hospitalization as necessarily a bad thing. I'm not sure that African Americans are more subject to more. I think it's maybe less so because we're viewed as criminals more. Hope that answers Dr. Nelson's question.
We also have a question from Ms. Clark that states, passion is typically misinterpreted as anger. When do we stop being responsible for other people's interpretation?
That is a tough one. I know me personally, when I get agitated or get animated, I'm doing it now, I talk with my hands. So I have to sometimes put my hands in my pocket when I'm dealing with certain individuals so they won't feel threatened because of the way I communicate. And I think that's something that Dr. Ryan spoke about, that, it's just our mannerisms. Sometimes, our mannerisms and what you've seen on television and what you've seen all the negative and how things go from 0 to 10 fast, and in the movies, when you look at, I would just say African-American males, so I'm speaking from my experience. And if you constantly see that, so every interaction to you is a potential threatening situation, or it may result in a violent situation. And I think those are the things that we have to kind of deal with. And I think it's interesting because we cannot, I don't think we can change their or help them to change their perspectives or whatnot. I think we just have to be conscious of it, and hopefully they'll see it as they have more interactions with individuals. Just my 2 cents.
Yeah, if I may, I'd like to chime in. I think I'm trying not to laugh, but I'm like, because I don't have a perfect answer either. But what I know has helped me professionally and personally is that I talk with my hands too. I'm doing better. You can't see, but sometimes I'm sitting on them. And so what I've learned to do to try to create connectivity between whoever I'm dialoguing with is to ask them, when I'm speaking with you, especially if I'm picking up that I'm putting someone off or they're uncomfortable, I will ask, what can I do to make sure that you feel safe? I mean, that's taken me years to get to that space because honestly, as an African-American female, I constantly feel like I am code switching or adjusting for those to, so it gets tiresome.
Yes, ma'am.
But I've learned to do it because what it does then for me is it allows me then to ask for you to do the same for me, right? So what I'm willing to give, I'm also saying, okay, but then I'm also inviting you into a space where then you can offer something as well so that we can begin to both create space and make people comfortable. That's my 2 cents on that.
Well said. I think that code switching is that voice too that we have to continue to teach. And it's just part of what we have to do. When I leave here and I take off this shirt and tie, I'm going to be a totally different person when I get back to my house and my friends start coming over to interact. But I know when I wake up in the morning, I put on this shirt and tie to walk into this school building, that I'll be a different person also. And it's just who we are and who we have to be at that moment. It doesn't say less of that, but I think it's just things we have to do to be successful. Hopefully it'll change in the next 10 years. We'll see what happens. Next question.
Okay, the next question from Ms. Brody is, what else can I do? I teach and supervise teams of care managers and therapists. We do trainings on cultural humility and culturally competent assessment and treatment planning. I was a clinician when Timothy Thomas was murdered. How can I be a true ally?
I think you're doing it now.
Yes.
Agree.
Yeah, I think you're doing it now. We need allies. We need people of lived experiences. We need people that don't quite understand but want to get involved. And what you just did to me is you're doing it. I think sometimes when I speak, I share stories because to try to get the point. So I remember being at a city council meeting, and it was about defunding the police. And I remember seeing my Caucasian brothers and sisters going off and nothing happening, no police carrying them out or anything. And then I remember my Black brothers and sisters going up to the podium saying the same thing, but very nicely. Where am I going with this? I think that white privilege is real. And I think that people put in power and have, positions such as a manager or a supervisor, they have unspoken powers or abilities that sometimes their colleagues or those up under them don't have. And so just being aware of what the struggle is and then being able to take it and communicate it into the rooms that we're not allowed into.
Definitely.
So I think that, she's doing that. And so I would say continue with that.
Totally. I definitely agree.
I do too. Having posed the question, let's say you're 80% there.
Absolutely. It says a lot about you, Leslie, definitely, to ask the question.
And thank you for what you're doing.
Yes.
The next question in the chat says, there are a number of African-American organizations fighting the same fight, but not fighting it together. How do we begin to pool our resources to become a greater force? We seem to focus more on being in the spotlight and grabbing dollars rather than truly helping.
Anybody?
Margot?
Margo. I don't know, and the more we can work together, getting at the table and being supportive of one another for the entire community is always the goal.
Right. And it's interesting because I belong to a number of organizations, and a lot of them, we do have the same goals and the same mission. So it's more of just kind of being aligned. And then you have different fractions where, the Black community is so large. It's interesting that with us is that I think the spotlight is on our organizations a little bit more, but I don't know if it's because we're more vocal or whatever, but all organizations have different fractions, and they have different conversations, and they may not see everything, 100%, but they're 85% or 90%. And I think we have to go with that 90% where we have common ground and we have to move forward and begin and continue to work together. So it's happening. Definitely could happen a lot more and on a larger scale, but I have seen it in Cincinnati, and so we have to continue to push on.
I think too, really quickly, because I know we're getting close to 4, it's as simple, I think sometimes, as picking up the phone and saying, hey, I'm a part of this organization and I know you guys are doing great work. How do we do this together? Seriously, I've seen it happen where, shout out to Center for Closing the Health Gap, who does great work, but it's also because of the partners and the CEO. She reaches out and because we can't do it alone. So I think recognizing that, right, that this is not something that's one person is going to fix. And when you know that, I think it changes your mindset on how you operate.
I totally agree. And if the client, the customer, is really the central point, no organization can provide everything.
Right.
Do what you do well, and then you have partners to help, because ultimately it's about the client.
And we are getting close to time, but there is one more question in there. Let's go ahead and take that question. I think
the question that was written is, I have recently been calling out white fragility. Is this something you all feel comfortable doing? And what do you think the outcome would be if more Black professionals did?
Okay, I'll go. Only because it's 3:59. I'll be honest. I see it, I deal with it, and I go talk to it about my African-American friends, but I am sometimes scared to call it out because I don't want to be looked at as that crazy, loud, emotional, emotive, angry African-American woman. But I think, where we are in today's society, it's kind of like, I believe that God is getting us all to a place to where we have to do it scared. right? So you do it even in spite of how you feel, and you do it with tact and you do it with love. Because one of the things that, what keeps coming to me is that in the midst of me trying to bring or shed light on my hurt, I am not trying to beat you down either, but I'm trying to bring this shared awareness so that we can be greater together. And if you think about it, I mean, even in simple husband-wife relationships, when those two come together, it's not always easy for one to hear what you're doing wrong. It's a muscle that has to be built. And I think if we think of it like that, when we're calling things out, we'll approach it with love, because white or black, we still family. We just got to continue to work with one another so that we can be unified.
Right. And I just think it's what
I don't call it out at all. Some people are bigots, and I try to meet them where they are. I may ask a few tiny series of questions to help lead you somewhere else, but you really can't change someone's behavior. I don't believe you can. And I think it's almost willful, and some of the impudence and bigotry that's displayed in the workplace. So I don't call them out.
It depends on the relationship, and I may do it more in private than in a group, but often I feel it's a gift to individuals to become aware of how they're coming across, or what racist thing has been said or done, or the perception of it.
I think in my position, I've actually just had to do this last week, and just had to have a conversation with another colleague, and just about their statement. They might have made a statement, and I had to ask them, if this was your child and somebody told you this, how would you feel? So I think I've approached it that way. I think in education, we almost have to call it out, because we're dealing with these lives and these young folks, and words hurt. And sometimes parents can't advocate for themselves, because my conversation is interesting. I said, would you have the same conversation with a parent in Mason? Would you tell this parent in Mason the same thing that you're going to tell our parents here? Would you tell them in a more fluent situation? And the answer was no. Why? Because that parent would fight. It would be lawyers in here, but they have to understand. And I think we have to continue to teach this as we move forward and have these conversations. So I think in my role as superintendent and instructional leader of a district, at times I have to call it out when I see it. I may not do it I don't do it in public, but you can best believe we're gonna have a conversation afterwards, be it in my office, behind closed doors, and we're gonna talk about it. And I do just what Mr. Cole said. I ask probing questions. And I think when I asked that question there, would you do the same thing to a parent? Would you say the same thing to a parent in Mason? And it was no. And I was like, yeah, and that's where we're at. With that though, I do want to say we are not just about out of time, we are out of time. So I'd like to thank all of you in attendance today, but especially our panelists for your time and attention to this vitally important conversation. We must not forget the importance of mental illness as we address the public health crisis that is racism. As the nation's largest grassroots mental health organization, it is NAMI's acknowledged responsibility to serve all. While still early in the intentional diversity, equity, and inclusion journey as an organization, NAMI has made a renewed commitment to these values and will continue to strive to deliver help and hope to all who needs it. You are not alone, and I'll say that again to everyone, you are not alone. I invite you to visit NAMI Southwest organization, so that's NAMI, NAMISWOH.org for our biopic mental health resources, and to learn more about how you can join the conversation and advocate for the mental health of all. I want to thank you all for another wonderful conversation and dialogue.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Everyone, be safe.
You too.
God bless.
Take care.